Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we are, of course, coming at you with a brand new episode talking about two brand new releases. We're going to be talking, of course, about another podcast staple artist, somebody who's been with us since the very beginning. We've got to cover their entire career trajectory up until this point, save for a little stuff there at the beginning. But we're talking about the newest album from rapper Backxwash. We're talking about the new album, His Happiness Shall Come First, Even Though We Are Suffering. And in a sort of hardcore week, we're also going to be covering the new album by noise rock band Show Me the Body. We're going to be talking about their new album, Trouble the Water. So it's a very sharp contrast into last week where we talked about the pop girlies, and this week we're talking about
a big difference.
The angry motherfuckers.
Well, it's not even just like that this is loud and aggressive music, but it's like all very sort of like left-wing radical loud aggressive music as well. Like it's from
very Soul Glow, Zealand Ardor, that new wave of artists, you know,
that we have always been championing as well. And I'm very excited, especially to talk about the Backxwash album, because not only is it, you know, the third Backxwash project we've covered since we covered our very first Backxwash release on our second episode of our show, but also it is the conclusion of a trilogy as well. So it's going to be exciting to reflect on where that trilogy has led us and what this new album represents. But we'll get to that. We've put some great videos out on the channel this week. August and I did a low-key, but I think great record club episode on the classic metalcore, post-hardcore record, The Satellite Years, from the band Hopes For. Bit of an overlooked record, but one of those ones where if you're real like into that emo post-hardcore, you know, early 2000s era, is one of those things where it's like you recognize the significance of that album and how massively important it is, the way that it incorporates elements of space rock and psych rock even to a certain extent into that metalcore framework is really, really inspiring and unique, and we had a great time talking about that. Also, I just uploaded a video on Friday counting down my 10 favorite Modest Mouse songs. I love doing these top 10 list videos, especially because I'm at the point now where if it's a band I really love, I can do it fairly confidently without scripting anything, and that's what I did. And I was really proud with how this video came out. Super emotional, super thoughtful. I thought look into one of the bands that essentially meant the most to me at a very critical pubescent stage of life. And honestly, actually, just to keep the theme going, we're going to be talking about music that meant a lot to me at that stage of life, but also that kind of reflects the ugliness of that stage of life in our next record club on One-Tricks Point Never's incredibly pubescent, dramatic Garden of Delete that I cannot wait to talk about. But before any of that, let's focus on today, what we've been listening to in the last 7 days. Jake, what have you been listening to?
Well, to sort of continue off of a tangent that we've started talking about, is that I have been listening to a lot of Modest Mouse this week. Incredible coincidence that like this just sort of happened to intersect of Riley having this video on the back burner and making it. And I, for whatever reason, just really got the inclination to do a re-listen that I've been meaning to do for a very long time, just because way back in like towards the beginning of last year, we actually did a record club episode off of the Lonesome Crowded West. And that was the first time I had heard that album, but that wasn't the first Modest Mouse record I had heard. Long before the podcast even started, at the recommendation of Riley, I listened to The Moon and Antarctica first. And I loved that album, but I hadn't re-listened to it in a while. And I was like, I wonder, I liked them, or I at least remembered liking them about the same. So I was just like, oh, might as well listen to them just to see where I come down on it. And oh yeah, The Moon and Antarctica. That's a fucking that's a record. I enjoyed this record even more than I thought I was going to upon revision. All my love to the Lonesome Crowded West, a great sprawling, epic disaster record that I love. But The Moon and Antarctica is just it's got a bit more of a honed in kind of, I won't say it's like a more personal album, but it definitely feels like it's coming from a more earnest place. I feel like a lot of the stuff on the Lonesome Crowded West is it's very dressed up in metaphors and stories and stuff, whereas Moon in Antarctica is very stripped back and laid bare, which lies in stark contrast to how that album actually sounds. The actual like raw sound of this record is something that I didn't fully appreciate the first go around that I had with it. The sort of like layers of occasional like neo-psych that are on this album are just fucking fantastic. Yeah. This is one of the best sounding records of its respective decade, and considering how early it came out in that decade, that's pretty fucking impressive. And of course, Isaac Brock's songwriting is consistently absolutely fucking amazing. God, trying to pick a favorite Modest Mouse song before Riley's list was difficult, just because I wanted to see if perhaps my favorite, whatever it would be, would end up on there. My favorite before this was probably Bankrupt on Selling from the Lonesome Crowded West, but I'd say that my favorite now is either Third Planet, the opening track, or The Stars Are Projectors. Both of which are stone cold 10 out of 10 songs. Go watch Riley's video to see if either of those songs make it on that list. But I adore both of those. I think one of the most interesting things about this album was I kept listening to it, and the sort of Midwest emo-ness of Modest Mouse's sound kind of really felt like it sort of put itself front and center here. At least I could hear a lot more of it now that my ears are a bit more trained to that. And the more and more I listened to it, the more and more this reminded me of another Jake Core classic, which is Brand New Science Fiction, where both of the albums seem to have like a dark, almost desert rocky vibe to them that feels like it's exploring this sort of desolate, doomy landscape that is occasionally, you know, the characters and the songs and on the album are caught between. And it's just, God, this is just one of those beloved records that's just every bit as good as people tell you it is.
It's obviously it's an album about sort of adolescence and going through like puberty and growing up to a certain extent as well. But it's like it tackles that through this like metaphorical lens of like desert landscapes, all those sorts of things, where like living in like the middle of nowhere essentially, or like exploring these sorts of empty spaces that kind of stretch on and on forever and feel like these kind of encroaching, this kind of inescapable labyrinth of America essentially becomes like a kind of metaphor for adolescence, essentially for growing up. It's one of the things that makes that album so powerful, right? And like so much of it revolves around like that feeling of lostness and trappedness inside this vast space that you feel so small inside of and you can barely comprehend, that all you can do is kind of look up at the stars and feel both even smaller, but also like that's your only way of escaping is by looking up into the sky. And it's a powerful and beautifully written album. It's absolutely astonishing, and a total indie rock classic that I couldn't be more delighted to see has really landed and resonated with you the way that it has. In retrospect, it makes a lot of sense because there's a bit of Brand New Science Fiction in there. It's a bit of like Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher in there and some of the visual ideas. Anyway, what else have you been listening to, Jake?
Well, Watashi wa Jake Desu, because I've been fucking Japan is not through with me, so of course I've been listening to a lot of the same stuff that I've been listening for the past couple of weeks. I've come across some really interesting curios though. Some like occasional records that just don't belong to like bands that I've listened to much of. I've listened to stuff like Boredom's album Vision Creation New Sun. I know a lot of people I know really love that album. That's a really great like warm neo-psych album that's just full of fucking immaculate fucking vibes. Really great shit. I listened to shit like, I mean, of course I've been listening to more Susumu Hirasawa, more Shiina Ringo, blah, 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 blah. But I also listened to an album called Kagiyaki by Masakatsu Takagi, and he is a composer Again, Japanese composers, they just be dropping solo records that are heat. People might know him for his soundtrack work for the film Mirai, which came out a couple of years ago, which is actually one of my personal favorite animated films. Yeah, exactly. This guy has an album that is 50 songs long. It is 2 hours long. And I was just kind of like, that's fucking intimidating, but it's like a bolded record like the people really love. And I looked at it and just like the genre tags on this were something else. It's like chamber folk, field recording, modern classical, just tons of shit.
This is Kagayaki, right? Like this is
yeah.
I've had this on my list for ages because this is like one of Connor's favorite albums of all time, and he's always telling me about like how fucking just masterful it is, and it's not usually a sort of thing that he's typically into, but it's one of those obvious records that's kind of like bridged a gap for a lot of people that and exposed them to something they had no idea they would have loved. So this is interesting to me. I've just never carved out the time for it yet.
Even with the kind of genre tags, I still didn't quite expect it to be the album that it ended up being. And despite what I've said of it being 2 hours long and it being fucking 2 discs, 50 songs, a lot of the songs are paced really, really well. A lot of them are really, really short. But this album's really, really great. And it's because it's such a unique experience. This basically feels like walking through the childhood of somebody who lived in like rural Japan. Like there are occasional bits of field recordings where you can hear like a family kind of like talking. It's got this really unique sort of pastoral feeling to it, and those sort of bits of modern classical that come up that are just like, you know, really faint piano motifs or just full-blown like actual chamber folk stuff. And sometimes they'll interact, like sometimes the characters in the field recordings will actually come to the forefront and do like an actual bit of like folk singing. And it's such an overwhelmingly joyous experience. It really does feel like it feels like you are living in a Studio Ghibli movie. It feels like movies like My Neighbor Totoro or Kiki's Delivery Service, where everything is just so relaxing and light and breezy, and it makes this 2 hours fly by very, very quickly. It's an album that is still incredibly dense with an immense sort of diversity in terms of its actual sound palette, but it all works. It never feels like it's giving you whiplash. It never feels like it's overstuffed. It never feels like it's spreading itself a bit too thin. It's all through that sort of connected through line of feeling like those, you know, those childhood memories. And it was a really valuable experience. I want to spend a lot more time with this record. I can see it. I mean, hell, it could be a favorite one day, but again, it's a lot to digest on just one listen. And on the note of listening to Japanese albums that eclipse 2 hours, I think the biggest thing for me this week was, of course, that I have, as Riley put it, finally begun my Fishmans arc. Don't know why it's taken me this long, but you know, some of the most acclaimed releases in the neo-psychedelic and dream pop field of music, this has been on my radar forever. And I won't speak too in depth because all 3 people here may be involved in a future project where we discuss the discography of Fishmans in a lot more depth. But so I started off by listening to Uchu Nippon Setagaya, their final sort of studio record in 1997. I had actually listened to Long Season way back in 2020. I remember very, very vividly. It was right as quarantine began. I was in the sort of phase where every couple of days I would drive to our local Walmart and have to wait about an hour to get a grocery order, because that was what everyone was doing and how everyone was getting groceries here. So I would just be in my car for about an hour out of a given day, and I would always pick something new to listen to while I was in the car. And I was like, hey guys, shoot me a recommendation. And then Riley was just like, Fishman's Long Season. And I'm like, I've never fucking heard of this shit before, sure. And I threw it on, and it was a lovely kind of ambient pop record that I was just like, wow, this is like really atmospheric and beautiful. And it has these absolutely wonderful jazz fusion keyboard tones on it that just make me giddy like a school child. So I don't know why it took me this long to keep listening to them, because I loved Long Season, and if anything, I love it more now. That was their sort of penultimate record in 1996, and now I've listened to all of their records save for the debut Chappie Don't Cry and Neo Yankees Holiday, which I will be getting to very shortly. But I mean, this isn't exactly a spoiler or anything, because we're obviously going to cover their discography, but I've more or less loved everything I've listened to from them. Kuchu Camp, Orange, King Master George, even one of their earlier records I took a great liking to.
King Master George is underrated as fuck. I love that album.
It really is, just because like Orange is certainly like, that's sort of seen as like the first truly like great cohesive statement from the band, and King Master George is like the furthest thing from that. If anything, that album is just like, it's fucking bug nutty as shit, and that's kind of why I really dig it. Like, Orange is a better album, but I think I get more out of King Master George just because they do so much wacky shit that I can't wait to talk about eventually on that record, that I just find super compelling and super fun. And even in their like least ambitious state, when they're doing like, you know, pop reggae shit, they're still doing it with such verve and such like genuine creative talent. It's mesmerizing shit. And so seeing them evolve over the course of their career has been a truly like really satisfying arc to follow. And I also of course listened to what is, I think, the highest rated live album of all time, which is their album 98 12 28, the Odoko Tachi no Wakare performance, which I also watched because that is live on YouTube. And it is a basically 2-hour-long live album that's basically songs from throughout their entire career, that ends everything off with a performance of Long Season, which is more or less one 40-minute long song. And this is one of the best new listens I've had all year, just because there are certain moments in this where like I was at work listening to this, and there were just moments where I felt like my knees were buckling. I was just like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Again, can't wait to talk about them. But this is an album that deserves every bit of the hype that's ever been put behind it. It's one of those records that feels like it's truly like, it's like Stop Making Sense, in the sense that it's like, this can only be a live album. Like this just like as a studio recording, to accomplish what they do on here, especially with the songs on that second disc, I feel like the live setting is not only like, you know, something that can kind of add to the vitality of the experience, like hearing live music can be, but it's also something that like when you feel the music just sort of envelop the venue that they're in, it's completely spellbinding. It's truly something else. And it conversely, like, it made me love Long Season that much more, just because this performance of it does some truly spectacular things. Some fucking Philip Glass, Steve Reich shit happens in the halfway point, and it's fucking amazing. And then I go back and I'm just like, I do still, of course, love Long Season, but it's going to be difficult to not just want to listen to the live version.
They basically turn part 3 of Long Season into like a 10-minute drum solo, essentially.
Yes.
Oh, dude, the drumming on every single Fishmans album is fucking amazing. Completely undersold part of this band is just that, like, well, these guys are fucking incredibly proficient musicians from the get-go. Even like the guitar solos on King Master George, whenever they pop up, they're fucking wicked. They're so good.
Well, this is the thing as well, like, people forget, because it's not, I guess, as fashionable in like online music spaces, but they're a dub band. They're a funk, a reggae adjacent dub band, essentially. So the rhythm section is the core to their identity as musicians, right? The bass and the drums are always super present in everything they do. And one of the amazing strengths of that live performance, you know, the whole live album, is how the atmosphere of that space gives that those bass and drum sounds so much more impact than they could possibly have on a studio record where everything has to be mastered and to have a certain, you know, sound that fits within the aesthetic of the album format. Basically, the live album, when done right, allows you to kind of transcend the limitations of typical record mastering and lets you create something where the space in which the music is recorded is as equal and important a part of the way it all sounds as the instruments themselves, right, and how they're played. So it's just, yeah, it's essential. Yeah. It's the best case you could possibly make for the power of the live album. And I know some live album skeptics out there, like our friend Zach, for instance, who even he would say that that record adds something and has value that you cannot just get from the studio recording alone. So it's a great argument for how powerful the live record can be as a document when it's recorded correctly, and of course when it's a performance and a show that lends itself well to that kind of format. And I mean,
it's not even the only great Fishmans live album. It's only the one I've listened to. They have a couple other ones that I have, of course, been told by Jacob and just by looking at, you can tell are essential. I can't wait to listen to stuff like the 96 performance or the Shinjuku Liquid Room one, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, they're also 2-hour long, you know, jammier sessions that are just like this band pure. Like a lot of bands even in this avenue can't really make their jammier stuff as compelling as, you know, when they're in the studio and when they're more tight and refined. I would say that Fishmans in that respect, in more than just one, honestly, really remind me of all things King Crimson, both in the sensibility of how they just sort of evolve their craft for the live album of being this monumental experience that feels like an evolution and sort of a complement to their work that's already great, and in the sense that you can just sort of feel Fishmans get more progressive as they go on. It's why Uchi Nippon Setagaya is such a fucking spectacular record from back to front. Another one of my favorite first listens of the year. God, the fucking Walking in the Rhythm, that's Night Driving. There's so many great songs that are on these albums. I also can't recommend enough that, like, if you want to gauge whether or not you're into this band or you just want to try them out, or if you just want to listen to a crash course of some of their like earlier stuff, check out the compilation Blue Summer, selected tracks 91 to 95. It remasters all of the tracks that it picks, and it's basically a double album. And I think it's kind of like the Sigur Rós Varfheim, where the first half is studio recordings and the second half is live. And this is a stellar fucking compilation. This is another band where I've been told by multiple people that their compilations, a lot of them, are just as essential as their other stuff too. And I believe that just because this is a band that, like, just by virtue of mixing different songs from different eras of their sound together, you get a unique experience out of that that's more or less supremely valuable in any form. So I'm also downloaded like both of their B-sides compilations that I can't wait to listen to. Just like I've gone out of my way to just like scour the internet to find everything for this band, and I can't wait to listen to more. And it's funny, at the end of last year, everybody was talking about the Beatles again just because of Let It Be, and that sort of spurred on a kind of wave of just like, I just saw everyone on my Twitter timeline talking about the Beatles last year, and it was just like, oh wow, kind of reinvigorating my love for a band I've loved for a very long time. It's very cool. And a similar thing kind of happened just because we finally got the remaster of Revolver. Perfectly timed for us to do our episode on that months before it gets the proper remastering. But I can't complain, just because I did go back and I listened to it, just because that is one of my sticking points. I've gone out of my way to either get the good remasters of Beatles albums, or like the most recent one that doesn't have the bad stereo panning. And finally, my favorite Beatles album, Revolver, can join the pantheon of the other records of being an album that you can finally properly hear, because that other remaster, the mono remaster, is good, but it lacks the depth of stereo. And then you put this on and it just sounds incredible. It feels like I heard Eleanor Rigby again for the first time. I mean, there are bits of Yellow Submarine in the second half where I was just like, damn, I'd never really picked up on that part ever being there. And even like the really dense tape effect heavy songs really benefit from this remaster. And this sort of got me onto a bit of a kick. And then I'm just like, Beatles, one of the first bands I ever truly loved. Great discography full of lots of nostalgic music that I love. And I've never properly ranked their albums. So I checked a few off of the list in listening to after Revolver. I also listened to Magical Mystery Tour, which I goddamn love that album. Yes, it is backloaded, but have you considered that all of the songs on the A side are also terrific? Shout out to shit like Blue Jay Way. It's
Blue Jay Way is one of the best Beatles songs, period.
Yeah,
absolutely. So is Fool on the Hill, for that matter.
You get it. Thank you. But yeah, that is a terrific album that I love. Sgt. Pepper, of course, I've talked about that before. And then I crossed off the sort of biggest obstacle in my way with re-listening to all Beatles albums, and that was, of course, re-listening to the White Album, just because, that album, it runs a bit long. The big double album masterpiece of the Beatles catalog. And it has been so long since I listened to this in full. Like, ever since I remember torrenting the Beatles discography back in like 2017, where like I got I remember that I found like a little torrent package that included like the Spanish versions that they recorded of stuff and like singles. It was a super comprehensive download. A shame the quality was dog shit, but I hadn't listened to that since I downloaded those albums, and I was just like, I really don't know what I would think of the White Album today, just because I think one of the ideas I gravitate towards the most in music is the idea of the masterpiece album. My favorite Pink Floyd album is The Wall. I really loved the new Big Thief album this year, and the new Beach House album. I love big, sprawling, messy, ambitious works where all of it manages to feel like it's at peace with itself somehow. And hell, my favorite Beatles related project, full stop, is George Harrison's solo album. I was
going to bring up All Things Must Pass.
Yeah, exactly. So this is like, ideally, I'm just like, oh, okay, this obviously has a bunch of songs that I already love on it. So, maybe this time I'll listen to it and I'll see the vision. And the remaster did help a whole lot with that. It's a great sounding record now. I tried. I really did. I think, and there's no hot takes here, the album's definitely good. It contains a vast proportion of like the ratio of good songs to bad songs is vastly in the album's favor, no matter how long or short they may be. But I mean, this has classics like Back in the USSR, internal fucking banger, Dear Prudence, great song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, immortal George Harrison cut, Blackbird, maybe my favorite song on here, one of Paul McCartney's best ballads, Helter Skelter, whole lot of fun, Revolution is on this album, and the closer, Goodnight, is a deeply underrated Beatles track. But I feel like Mike the Snare, when he did his segment on the White Album, when he was just like, you may be thinking, wow, Mike, you're leveling so many compliments at the White Album. You must really love it. To that I say, no. And the thing is about this is that this encounters an issue where, a lot of the songs are shorter. It's a very well-paced album for being as long as it is. but it has that problem that we often run into on albums we've reviewed on this show, where people, I think the argument many defenders of albums like this would say, and that I would pose for many records, is that, you know, you kind of have to listen to it as one big thing. Like isolating certain songs is kind of antithetical to the experience, because, you know, you can isolate and say that Wild Honey Pie is a terrible song, but it's sort of meant to be a sort of irreverent interlude between two more significant tracks. And I do buy into this, but I also think that that's not sort of a coverall defense for the fact that a lot of these songs are just kind of fine. Like, a lot of them are just kind of okay. And if you wanted to say, well, this isn't supposed to be a singular song, it's just supposed to be this part of the album, and I'm like, well, the thing about that is that part needs to be better.
Well, the thing about the White Album, LNGG, and I say this as someone who has it rated, I think, about the same as you do, is that, like, what your take is like absolutely fair game, and it's very representative of a very particular way of approaching records and record critique that is very much something we like to engage in on this show. But I think that there is also a lot of merit to the argument that the White Album is more valuable and even more great for kind of what it represents, more than even how good the songs are, as maybe much of a cop-out as that can sound. It's just this kind of gargantuan mess. And the big thing I see a lot is, you know, people saying, you know, how could we make the White Album better by like tuning it down to like a tight 12 tracks?
Yeah,
and it really misses the point, because even if you do that, even if you do that with the 12 best songs, it still won't really hang together any better than the full 30 song thing does. And that's the kind of whole thing, is that, like, the White Album, as an album, it's very flawed. Like, it's ridiculously flawed, in fact, and it kind of it disregards a lot of what even the Beatles themselves had embraced and laid out as some of the basic conventions of LP record structure. It's like deliberately flying in the face of all of that. But also, it's like it's kind of a physical document and representation of a very, like, creatively dramatic stage in the life cycle of the Beatles, the band. It reflects what the band themselves were going through, like the ways in which they were fracturing and falling apart. And their subsequent records as well, you know, Abbey Road, Yellow Submarine, Let It Be, you know, as varied in quality as they are, also in their fracturedness reflect that, you know, basic disintegration of the Beatles that basically had already begun by this point. And so, like, it's interesting to view those albums as like continual steps in an analog for the disintegration of the biggest band in the world, and kind of seeing how these personalities that had once been so unified on records like Help and Rubber Soul and Revolver were kind of like splintering, and the ways in which they used to kind of lock together were not happening as well anymore. And they were, you know, the individual voices within them were starting to grow so distinct that they brushed up against each other within the albums in ways that make the records feel like a deliberate clashing artifact, essentially, that is sort of,
you can feel that on the singular tracks, because these are the songs that are like the least blended of like the creative
they sound like the individual
the
tracks of each performer are being like recorded separately, and I don't get the impression that any of these songs are being played live at all.
They are so within their own confines. It's like when a song is a fucking piece of like classic rock, like back in the USSR, or fucking
Helter Skelter,
like those songs are like wholly dedicated to being perfect sort of emblems of their genres and influences that come from the singular minds of the Beatles. And in that respect, I completely agree with you. It's the White Album is an album that maybe is like the most flawed album that I wouldn't change anything about. Just because as that document, it is 100% valuable, and I find a lot intriguing about it. And it's like many great bands don't go on to make their mess. Lots of great bands never get to make their Fleetwood Mac's Tusk, and
which is the pinnacle example of this type of record, I think.
And you want an album like that from a band purely because you want to see what it's like when they kind of implode a little bit. I think we kind of talked about that with Porcupine Tree's The Incident, where it's just like getting to see them exist outside the realm of like traditional structure is a novelty that's worth it if the musicians are great enough. And these are four of the best musicians who's ever lived, so it's hard not to see the vision with that a little bit, even if they kind of did my boy George a little dirty there. Which to make up for that fact, I actually like George Harrison actually has, in my opinion, a deeply underrated solo catalog, even beyond All Things Must Pass. I actually listened to his Self-Titled this week, which is a really late career album from him, which is terrific. I mean, it's just some great folk pop that you wouldn't really expect to come from maybe the most classic rock inclined Beatle, but it feels like you're getting to hear, like, all of George's solo stuff is, you feel like you're getting to hear the music that has been repressed within a great artist for like 10 years because he just wasn't able to get it out when he was in the Beatles.
I think that one of the things that's emblematic of what's so like, sort of clever, or at least sort of self-aware about this record, whether you like it or not, is like, if you compare the version of Revolution 1 or Revolution on this to the single version of it, it's like, they deliberately fucked it up on the album version, or they deliberately kind of did it in a way that made it, I would say objectively weaker, even though I still like it because it's a great song. They deliberately made it sound like less good, in the same way that, like, a band like Spoon did with songs on Transference, where they would deliberately kind of fuck them up. And a lot of bands have done that sort of over the years as well, where it's like kind of trying to play with their appeal a little bit, right, by writing like a perfect rock or a perfect pop song, and then just kind of within the studio fucking it up deliberately to kind of ruin it a bit. And I'll also say my other White Album hot take, for as, just absolutely colossally messy as the album is, I actually think the C-side of this record, which is from Birthday through to Long, 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 is honestly a really great side of music. I mean, yes, everybody's got something to hide except me and my monkey on it. And of course, it opens with Birthday, which is, at best, a little bit of a throwaway.
Mother Nature's Son is one of the best songs on the album.
Mother Nature's Son is great. I have a very big soft spot for your blues. Sex and Sadie is great. And my pick for the most underrated song on the record, Long, 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 which is one of my absolute favorite Beatles songs, wraps up that side as well. So it's like, there's like stretches on that record where I'm completely invested. And if you want to do something very sacrilegious, you can do what I've done and swap out the Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey with the cover of that song that the art rock band The Feelies did on their album Crazy Rhythms, which is one of my favorite covers ever, and is just immaculately superior to the original, and just pretend that it's the Beatles. But it's such a fucked up record, and I've always like enjoyed just kind of just playing around with it and just sort of like, wrestling with it. It's a record you wrestle with, and it wrestles back, and like that's just super, super entertaining at the very least. Okay, well, as for what I've been listening to, first thing I'll talk about is that in the world of music, or at least in the world of like faggoty indie electronic music that I am super, super fucking, indebted to, one of the great sort of, it's weird because they're originally like a sophistopop sort of like new wave adjacent band, but then in the 80s, but then in the 90s they made a kind of full tilt pivot into like trip hop and drum and bass, and they pulled it off really well. I'm talking, of course, about the eternally beloved Yorkshire band Everything But the Girl, who I definitely, to be fair, even though this band were like right up my alley, I didn't really get into them very much until like much later, after I had kind of been familiar with their main comparison points, which are bands like Massive Attack, Portishead, that sort of thing. But they announced this week, very excitingly, that next year I think they said in spring of next year, they're going to be releasing a new album, which will be their first album in 24 years. So
wow.
that's very,
Yeah.
very, very fucking exciting. To me, this band is kind of like the trip hop Sweet Trip, if I were to sell them in a very succinct way that would appeal to
Go
you
on.
two. So I went back this week and I gave a listen to their last album, Temperamental, a record I had heard before, but it'd been a while. So I put this album on again. This is just, it's a classic. It is one of the best trip hop, down tempo, deep house, atmospheric drum and bass, all those subgenre tags that you would associate with it. It is just one of the best records in that vein. The biggest appeal of this album is that it is immediate. It is not a record that grows on you. It is a record that has fucking hard beats that knock. And the interesting thing about that is because like it's a really hard knocking album, but like it's a really relaxing album as well. Like it's not an album that makes you kind of like, you know, amps you up and gets you like full of endorphins or whatever. They're a really chill band, but they're just like a chill band that are really punchy at the same time. They're kind of like Arab Strap in that way, kind of crossed with Portishead. But yeah, Temperamental is kind of generally regarded as their most beloved album. It's an hour long, but there's only 10 songs, so you get to spend a lot of space in these tracks, and it's very concise and very well paced for a record like that. The connection, if you haven't heard any of their music before, you may have heard Tracy Thorn, the vocalist, who sings on my favorites Massive Attack song, which is the title track on their album Protection. She does the vocals on that. And so she is, and this is a kind of husband and wife band, Tracy Thorn and Ben Watt. And so, yeah, if you want to get into some low-key electronic music with a real sort of like dance background, then I can't recommend their records from the end of the 90s enough, especially their last 3 records, which are all, I haven't heard all of them, but from what I have heard, they're all fantastic. I'm going to make sure I revisit basically their entire discography before the new album comes out, because I love Temperamental. It's a stellar record. I can't recommend it enough. Just so fucking beautiful and hard at the same time. So yeah, really excited to see what they pull out with whatever they've been up to, whatever the new album ends up sounding like. It's kind of hard to predict since they've kind of evolved so much, or they did evolve so much during their 80s and 90s progression. But yeah, I'm really, really stoked to hear. It's amazing news, and I can't recommend them and that record enough. In a similar sort of low-key electronica vein, I want to, again, cautiously recommend, because I don't think this is a great album, and I think that if you're not in the mood for what it offers, it probably won't leave any impression on you. But a band that I have always been fond of, that released one of my favorite electronic albums of the 2000s, the band Junior Boys, put out a new record the other week. They're like kind of like a dark sort of synth pop, minimal kind of nocturnal sort of stripped back club bass band. And they put out a string of records in the 2000s that really kind of took this sort of ambient pop and fused it with this kind of club sort of minimal house aesthetic and created a really unique sound that essentially like I grew up on and has always meant a lot to me. Their first album, 2004, was The Last Exit, especially one of my favorite albums ever. Definitely my favorite ambient pop record, and my favorite record I would describe as ambient pop. It's minimal, it's beautiful. The synth tones are kind of burbling and bass heavy, but really warm. And there's a real pop sensibility to the best moments. Songs like Birthday, songs like Teach Me How to Fight. I'll always love that record. And the album that came after it as well, 2006's So This Is Goodbye, which kind of turned up the pop element a little bit more and made them a bit less minimal and a bit more kind of punchy. That features one of my favorite songs ever on it, which is the song In the Morning. Anyway, they've never really dropped off. I mean, those first 2 albums are definitely their best, but every album they've put out since then, I've enjoyed to varying degrees, especially the very underrated 2011 album, It's All True. And they're back with their first album in 6 years, which is called Waiting Game. And, you know, this is a strange superlative to give an album, but I think this is the quietest album of 2022. Like, this is an album that, like, it flirts frequently with complete silence in a way that I find really strange and captivating. And that wouldn't be that unusual if it was kind of like, you know, minimal drones, sort of like straight up ambient sort of record, but it's not. It is an ambient pop record. It has those same sorts of elements that they've always had, but it's so stripped back that at certain points it like barely exists. It's kind of like, it's sort of like white noise as much as it is like ambient pop music, but not like white noise in the sort of like distorted low sense, but like it's very pretty, it's very pristine, it's very stripped back, and I've kind of just really enjoyed just sort of laying down and listening to it. It's sort of isn't music that matters much, which I know is a really sound like a really harsh thing to say, but sometimes it's kind of like the sort of wallpaper pop that can really provide a sort of like warmth or an additional sort of layer to your waking state that just makes everything feel a little bit sweeter. You know, it's not, you know, there are certain parts of the record that I think could be stronger for what it's doing. It definitely starts out with its two best songs, although the last two songs are also really great as well in their own way. It's a short album, it's 36 minutes. But yeah, it is a strange record, and if any of the ways in which I've described it appeal to you, you may enjoy it as well. And I would suggest as well going back to one of their first two records as well, because they are just absolute classics of minimal bass heavy synth pop that I think deserve a bit of a reappraisal. And the last thing I will shout out is I have been, so obviously a big theme of this, not obviously, because only people close to me will know this, but a big theme of this year for me has been like getting into video games and like getting into my gamer era and all that sort of thing. And just sort of like, you know, discovering and reaffirming my appreciation for a form of art that I've ignored for a really long time, mostly out of just kind of fear of not being able to get into it or accessibility or all those sorts of things, all stupid reasons, whatever. So I played a lot of video games this year, really trying to like build up my arsenal of video games that I have played so that I feel like I can have, when I have an opinion on a game, it actually means something, as opposed to just being, I've played 5 games, I like this one. I'm trying to play as many games as possible this year so that I kind of, from a variety of genres as well, although most of them have been either platformers, puzzle games, or Metroidvanias. But I have developed a real fondness for Metroidvanias, and none are better, at least none that I've played, have been better than 2017's Hollow Knight, which is a very beloved game.
Ooh,
great game.
A game that, you know, I've come to understand is sort of one of those sort of rare instant classic games, along with kind of like Breath of the Wild and all those sorts of other exploration adventure games, where as soon as it lands, it's like, you know, it's just one of those games that appears sort of fully formed and just sort of instantly kind of finds a niche in a market that just explodes, especially considering it's an indie game, right? So anyway, I started playing Hollow Knight like a month ago, I think. I'm very close to 100%ing it. I've got like 50 hours logged on that game at this point. It's an amazing game. It's probably my second favorite game that I've played, just behind Outer Wilds. But anyway, the thing I want to shout out, this being a music podcast, is the score for this game by Christopher Larkin is stunning. It's an incredibly beautiful game soundtrack. And I mean, every area within the game, every distinct biome is just very like, has its own distinct palette and visual design and all these sorts of things that you would want to distinguish different areas of a game. But also the music is a big part of that as well. And the music distinguishes the different areas of this game and helps so much to elevate and kind of impress the emotional state that those different areas visually and through gameplay also evoke in you. Because the thing about Hollow Knight is that a lot of it is sort of taking place in the sort of dilapidated, sort of post-apocalyptic, you know, underground landscape, essentially. So a lot of the biomes are sort of filled with sort of decay and infection, all that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of beauty in it as well. And so Christopher Larkin's score for this game really is a huge part of what makes that work as well. And so I've been listening to it a lot. I mean, obviously, just while playing the game, you just end up listening to it a lot as a process of that.
Yeah.
But I also have been listening to it outside of that as well. I think that, there's certain tracks on there, like the soundtrack to Green Path and the City of Tears and the Resting Grounds, and some of the boss music as well is just absolutely insane. Amazing soundtrack. And like, if it's weird to recommend a soundtrack to someone who hasn't like played the game, but like, check this out even if you haven't played the game, and if the music appeals to you, you'll probably have a great time with the game, whether or not Metroidvanias / sort of combat games, which this is kind of like a fusion of those two things, whether or not those appeal to you or not, you'll probably have a great time regardless if you enjoy the music, because it does a really great job of evoking what the game is like to play as well. So yeah, here, it's a unusual, out of character thing for me, but here I am recommending a video game soundtrack on the Jams and Tea podcast. It works beautifully as just a general soundtrack to anything, really, and it's a stunning game that is getting a sequel next year as well, which I'm very excited about.
Hell yes.
So yes,
in development forever.
Yeah, so that is those are my recommendations for this week. Jacob, as our guest, it's your turn now. Anything you want to shout out that you've been listening to recently?
I've been continuing my 1990 quest, if you will. Last time I was on here, I was about halfway done. Now I got 1 week left, 1 week's worth of albums. And then after that, I decided, fuck it, we'll do 1990 extras, which is stuff that was either really popular at the time or like stuff that like stuff that just fell on the radar of the voters and whatnot. I want to shout out a few albums from there that were just like really, really good first listens. First one is John Zorn's Naked City.
Yes,
I was not prepared for the. Like, I saw the genre tags on RYM and I was like, "What is this about? What am I about to listen to?" And then I listened to it, and I just was like, hardcore punk versions of like film noir soundtracks. What? And I loved every minute of it. Yes, that was amazing. I loved every fucking minute of this thing. Easily one of the best things I had heard like from the term that I just was not familiar with before. And it just like reading up on this guy and how he had done so many versions of these where he would just do these interpretations of Ennio Morricone scores, and he like started the experimental music scene, and like there would just be shit that would be like 30 seconds long that was just like a wail of like trumpets and saxophones and guitar. Reminded me of, if y'all remember that band Little Women, that was like, they had that one album called Throat, and it just like starts out like with the most bug nutty jazz shit you've ever heard. That was what John Zorn reminded me of. And I just, God, like as like somebody, who's into like movie soundtracks, into movies in general, this was a real treat and I loved every minute of it. But I ended up not voting for it in the poll because Judas Priest Painkiller, which is a fucking masterpiece too. Which I had not heard all the way through. I had only heard the title track, and that is also an assault on the ears with adrenaline and energy, and yet I was transcending throughout every single fucking song. I was that is a fucking album. I just like 1990 I think has some it was a really strong year for metal, at least like with the albums that have been suggested. The only one I ended up not really liking was Ritual de lo Habitual, but like most of what I had heard, and that may be my favorite metal record of 1990, even though I had heard Seasons in the Abyss and fucking Rust in Peace, all of which are great records, but this was everything I want from a metal record. Just amazing riffs with like every instrumentalist and every member of this band just like at the top of their fucking game. And then when he just like Rob Halford is just showing off in that first track with like his falsetto as fuck voice, and then immediately goes back down to like his normal voice for the rest of it. And at 70 years old today, this man can still fucking sing. I hope to have
fucking insane shit.
I love that album. And then like right immediately after that, I get another strong 9 out of 10 record, Depeche Mode Violator, which I had not heard before. Which is, I mean, that's already one of the most acclaimed synth pop albums of all time. You don't need me rapturing like voluptuous praise at it. But I will say that Waiting for the Night is probably my favorite song by the band and one of the best songs of its era, in my opinion. But oh God, like, and it was up against like an underdog of a record because it was like seed 123 versus Depeche Mode's Violators, seed number 6. It was from a band called Killing Joke, Extremities, Dirt, and Various Repressed Emotions. If you want to hear like I had only heard that one song, 80s, which is, you know, like this kind of like really tight post-punk song. So I was thinking, okay, this is going to be another post-punk record. Imagine post-punk fused with industrial metal. That is what that Killing Joke record is. It is insane and tight, and it's just so much fun, but also just like, you know, they're writing lyrics about like how they think the world is fucking doomed. So of course you're trying hard not to relate to every single lyric, but also you're just having so much fun, like hearing fucking blast beats on an industrial or post-punk song. And I'm just like, who are you guys? Where the hell have you been all my life? So that's a band I now need to check out.
Absolutely. Listen to Nighttime. That's an amazing, that's the album with 80s on it. And that is, that's the only one I've heard. But that was like, that's like one of my dad's like favorite records, which is so funny to me because he's not really that much into a lot of music like it. It's much more sort of in the kind of gothic sort of, you know, post The Cure sound sort of thing compared to the noisier stuff later on. But it is like an 80s classic. And I think you'd probably really enjoy that, especially if you already like the song 80s.
It's a good song.
Nighttime is just a really great record. I need to like message my dad and ask him like what other Killing Joke records I should listen to, because he's my only connection to that band, weirdly enough.
Yeah, but check out that check out it's a hard time. Extremities, Dirt, and Various Repressed Emotions. Highly recommended. One of my, again, another favorite discovery, but my favorite discovery of 1990. I have to set the scene for you.
No.
It is, okay, so most of these albums are chosen by, you know, like most of the participants in this tournament are like Gen X. Like, you know, born in 70s, and some of them are British. And so like you will find a lot of jangle pop. Now, I do not mind jangle pop as a genre. I am not anti-jangle pop, but Jesus Christ, there were so many mid bands that were like trying to be the Smiths. And it was, and again, and when you have to listen to several of them in a row, it gets fucking exhausting. Like a lot of the British bands, again, like my big statement was America and New Zealand did the genre better, because like Blake Babies and the Chills over most of these bands any day, over like House of Love and the Lightning Seeds and the Laws. I was just so tired, and they felt like they were all just like melding into one big plate of cold soup or bowl of cold soup. But then at the end of that jangle pop tunnel, here I was, exhausted and sad, and just being like, come on, like give me something heavy, give me something harsh. And then they're like, Sanchez, we have just one more jangle pop record for you. I'm like, okay, fine. Is it from the US? No, it's from the UK. Fuck. Okay, fine, I'll listen to it. What is it? And then it ended up being my favorite thing I discovered in the whole tournament, which is Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic by the Sundays.
Yeah, you're on that Maycore shit right now. Yes,
it was a very good record.
I was like, this shit gave me chills. Like the way these guys play, I forget what her name is, what the singer is, but she has one of the most haunting voices I have ever heard. And these lyrics about like, I don't know, like not to get personal, but I relate to being like feeling fucking stuck in your hometown and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I was just like listening to this shit. Like, is she me? Have I been like, you know, I was absolutely in love with every single fucking track on this record. How they managed to switch everything up. How impossibly tight and yet loose this musicianship was. And how she like painted these beautiful pictures with her words. this was, like, spoiler, this is my second favorite of 1990. And this was like, I listened to it 3 times and I slapped the old 10 out of 10 on it.
This is very very validating, because I also listened to this. I think it was back in January, and like I instantly gave it a 10 as well. It's just one of those records that's so attuned.
No, it wasn't the genre's fault. It
was one of those records that was just so immediately attuned to like what I love about jangle pop, or what I love in jangle pop. And it is so much to do with the presence of the vocalist. Like, yeah, I mean, the music is fantastic also, and very beautiful and dreamy and enrapturing, but that almost doesn't matter as much if the vocalist isn't like able to evoke something specific and powerful and captivating in their own right. And Harriet Wheeler, who's the singer in this band, is absolutely able to do that. She's just so unique and powerful and captivating, the same way that Sue Tompkins from Life Without Buildings is, or even like the front woman of Dry Cleaning, who I've also been listening to this week, has the same quality to the way that she sings. But yeah, it's an amazing record that I'm super stoked that it connected with you the way it did. It's just one of those albums that, like, along with that Primitive Radio God song about standing outside a broken phone booth, I would say that Here's Where the Story Ends is one of the great sort of like forgotten singles of the 90s.
Yes. Oh, it's so fucking
good. That
good.
song was actually like a minor hit when it came out, and enough to kind of penetrate, like, you know, alternative radio in the 90s. And so it's one of those songs where you kind of like, a lot of people have sort of very distant memories of it, or they'll know that song even if they don't know the Sundays or the album very well. And it's also like that in concert with the fact that like the song itself is just such a perfect like piece of, like, it just sounds like, you know, inherently nostalgic, no matter what your history is or where you've come from. It's just one of those perfect songs like that. And then you listen to the album, and the whole fucking album is like, here's where the story ends, essentially. And it's just, it's eternal. It's one of those records that feels like the first time you hear it, that you've known it your entire life in a weird way. And then actually getting to, you know, actualize it and point to it as a real thing, as opposed to just an ephemeral fucking feeling, is very satisfying. All right, let's get into the first of our main reviews for today, which is the new album from Show Me the Body, Trouble the Water. Show Me the Body. I always love when we get to talk about a band, we get to review a new record from a band that's kind of like has very few actual precedents in anything that we've talked about before. Like,
I've never seen the Rate Your Music descriptor Synth-Punk before.
Oh my god! Hey, look, I could point you towards some great synth-punk, but that's a discussion for another day.
I'm sure.
Look, I love when we get to talk about a band that where it's like, yeah, we can try and force comparisons for the sake of like doing our jobs here, but really they only sound like Show Me the Body. They have different genres that they kind of fuse together, and different sounds and instrumentational choices and personalities and whatever. Like, you could, like, you know, an obvious and somewhat cheap comparison that feels, you know, like something that might be common is, you know, you could compare them to like Viagra Boys, maybe to a certain extent. But even that feels really facile. It doesn't really get at the unique appeal of what they do, and also reduces a lot of their musical. It's kind of like, you know, there have been a spate of bands, you know, I think, and to this band's credit, they kind of predate all of them. There have been a spate of bands, and recently I think of that Viagra Boys record. I also think of the Gear Band record that came out really recently as well, where it's like this very particular sort of postmodern sense of humor, and it has this kind of particular focus on real sort of social and progressive issues as well. Like Idols comes to mind as well. And the approach is just to be as punishing as possible in the expression of sheer rage and confusion and ultimately bewildering overwhelmingness. In that sense, the best comparison point in terms of a record that's come out this year is Soul Glow's Diaspora Problems,
Yeah,
which is
that's
another
what I thought of.
album where, with through its sheer commitment to punk ethos, funneled through also its ostensible hip-hop clothing, it gives you something that is a completely refreshing and new take on a particular style of hardcore music, essentially. And Show Me the Body, who've been around since the early 2010s, and their first record, 2016's Body War, kind of outlined this and sort of set the stage for this with this particular blend of like hardcore music and hip-hop. They have ever since then continued to mine this strange and unique fusion of sounds that can only really be described as Show Me the Body. And I've never really gotten into this band. I've always kind of been aware of them. I went back and listened to Body War this week just to kind of remind myself of where they came from. I know that our friend Zach, is a huge fan of this band as well. So it was exciting to finally get a chance to actually spend some time with them and listen to this new record, Trouble the Water, which is absolutely incandescent. I mean, this is loud as hell. It's distorted as hell. It is angry, but it's also very it's angry in a way that is like, it doesn't bludgeon you over the head as violently as something like Soul Glow does, but it really just kind of gets under your skin. I mean, I don't know, how would you guys describe this?
They punch me in the face and sing a country ballad over it, or a folk ballad over it. This is the first time I've ever listened to them. I knew they were like a pretty fairly beloved recent metal band. I know that they had gotten some acclaim. I knew from the descriptions I had read about them in the past. They said like, they're like rap rock, like, and so I'm like, oh, new metal. Okay, that sounds like something like interesting. And then and that's where my brain was at the time. So that's what I initially thought of these guys. And then I listened to their most recent album and I was like, all right, hit some verses on me. And then I listened to country guitar and Jesus Lizard-esque rhythms. And I'm like,
ooh,
who
good
are
call.
these guys?
Yeah.
Good call.
Yeah, that's the thing for me this week. Like I haven't spent as much time with this record as I would want to. I've only listened to it 3 times, which I guess maybe sounds like a good amount, but I still haven't really processed it, I don't think. But part of that is how unique the particular fusions of sounds and influences, and also just the distinct idiosyncratic personality of the frontman of this band, who is named Julian Cashwan Pratt, essentially. His particular, like, for starters, his vocal style is, it's going to be one of those things where you're immediately turned off it or you're like intrigued. He is, to put it frankly, he's tuneless, which is fine because, he's a punk vocalist, right? You don't expect fucking, it's fine to be tone deaf. Like, the whole point is not that you sound good, but he particularly leans into the snarly kind of, frequently kind of off-key tonality to his voice that really is going to be like one of those things that you need to be able to get used to, or you need to be able to enjoy in the context of this music in order to be able to get into this band. And what I particularly
like a demonic
love,
combo of Alexis Marshall and the frontman of Slayer.
Yeah, like what I particularly love is like you have this snarling kind of aggressive, angry voice. And that is matched with these other sonic incorporations, which are like on paper baffling, but when they're all combined together, makes for something that is legitimately one of the most unique sounds that I can.
Banjos.
Yes, the frequent presence of the banjo and the influence of the folk tonality that brings, but also the synthesizer, sampler, and bass work of Harlan Steed as well, who is one of the other key members of this band. Who he got me a Steed, who brings to this band such a unique set of like aesthetic signifiers and weird tonalities that makes them even more difficult to kind of wrap your head around. The synthesizer work on this album is dirty. It is disgusting. disgusting. It is scuzzy. It's also frequently just detuned and ugly. Like, it particularly
Cult of
stands out
Luna
to me.
synths.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like, Cult of Luna are too, I think, tasteful to even really get close to what this band
Probably.
do. But for instance, a good example of this with these synth tones is Radiator, the third song on this record. It's disgusting. Like,
it's a Black Dresses song in the disguise of a sludge metal song.
It sounds ugh. Yeah, it sounds like the buzz of a radiator, honestly. Like, never has a song title been more descriptive. And that's why it rules. Like, I'm not saying that as a negative connotation at all. It fucking slams.
No, it really, like, and again, I think there are similar tonalities on that Soul Glow record as well, which kind of brings it to mind as well. I think of tracks like Driponomics and stuff, which was like a fusion of trap and like this really sort of weird harsh noise synth stuff that they do. And like the way in which this band collides those harsh noise textures with proper punk ragers like We Came to Play, which you sure did, fellas, because this one fucking bumps. Food from Plate as well is another huge standout in that regard. A deep cut favorite of mine is the track Demeanor, which is just like, I think, one of the catchiest and most memorable songs on this record, one of the snottiest as well. The great thing about this album is that it has a very distinct set of textures that it cycles through, but it never repeats itself, I don't think, even though it acts within a very particular palette. And it is really concise, so it never really outstays its welcome either. I mean, Jake, what do you think as someone who I presume was just kind of thrown into this with very little warning?
It certainly, like, especially the first track, Loose Talk, I was certainly just sort of like, what the hell? But like, that's the thing about this, is that this is so designed, you know, it's like a lean 38 minutes, it's 12 songs, none of them are like particularly long. And other than just being like on a quality level, the consistency here is truly marvelous. There's like nothing on here that slacks. There's nothing on here that maybe reaches the heights of, say, you know, like a Soul Glow, for instance. But man, if you just want a really sludgy hardcore punk album, here you fucking go. This has been one of the easiest, like, I mean, despite the fact that it is abrasive and ass kicking, it's just, this is one of the easiest album listens for the podcast I've had all year, just because it's so easy to throw on and just bang your head to it. It's got like, there are hooks all over it that I think take advantage of the lead singer's uniqueness by, like, you can't not imitate the hooks in his voice. And despite not probably being able to match whatever the fuck he sounds like on here, but like, there's just lots of great fucking pulse pounding moments that also have, like, the album's sort of adorned in these occasional flourishes of like folk instruments being implied in a metallic sludgy way, which actually reminded me a lot of this is like if Tom Waits's Bone Machine was like a sludge punk album, and you know, just like from the, you know, the monotonous kind of delivery and the sort of affectations that he employs, I get a lot of mileage out of that. And I just really, really get along with shit like, again, Food from Plate, I think, is a fucking knocker.
This is a song, right? So to talk about, sorry, not to interrupt, but just to kind of embellish on what you're saying, like, this is a song where the refrain is about fucking stabbing a cop in the face, essentially. It's like, and it's like, so we have all these bands, right? We have bands like Idols and Vagabonds, all that sort of thing. They do this kind of like, it's postmodern, but it's also kind of like deliberately kind of blunt, and it's all about kind of like this aggression that's channeled into this kind of
like, punch a Nazi, ha ha ha.
Whereas this feels like, I feel like when I'm listening to this, I'm listening to someone who genuinely could be capable of anything, and it's fucking frightening in some ways as well.
No,
and it doesn't feel
that's the cool thing about this and Soul Glow, is that when I'm listening to this, it's like when you're listening to this type of music, you know, like the, you know, like leftist radical shit, I don't want softball punch a Nazi shit. I want fucking stab a cop. that is exactly the kind of shit that you go for when you're going for like just aesthetically brutal shit like this. And like it really takes advantage of the fact that it just is 38 minutes long by not relenting. I think a lot of like again, a lot of the same comparisons that I brought up with Soul Glow I can bring up here. A lot of Black Flag, a lot of Bad Brains on here. That's just like, yeah, right. Like a lot of
I thought of
just
Henry
like
Rollins a lot.
really personality driven shouty vocals. And there are moments where they kind of throw you for a loop a little bit, like on World War IV, which I just think is hysterical as a track title, just being like, because most bands would be like, oh, we're gonna call the song World War III, and they're like, no, 4, motherfucker. And it starts off really like it kind of throws you for a loop a little bit there at the start. You're just kind of like, what the fuck is this fucking banjo plucking? What the fuck is happening here? And then I mean, they're gonna burst down the door eventually, and once it gets there, it's supremely satisfying. And that's sort of the word of the day with this album, is that this album is heavily satisfying. If you just need something to kind of thrash about to, the fact that this is eclectic and takes lots of different instruments together and like is kind of weird, it has that same sort of primal urgency that the Zeal and Ardor record from this year had, where it's a really unique combination of sounds, but all of them never take spot away from the album's priority, which is to beat your fucking head in. And as such, I enjoyed it immensely. It's very well paced. It's very consistent. There's a diverse range of instruments. It still gives the impression to me that this is an act that I haven't heard their earlier work, but this is an album that really shows me a lot of promise. I feel like this is something that they can take further and push harder. Like this, it does actually remind me a lot of like Daughters without the grindcore necessarily. Like you can sort of feel like they have a you can't get what you want like in them perhaps, and I'm really eager to see what that might look like down the road.
Yeah, the other reference point I thought of as well, just in terms of other albums besides the Soul Glow one that happened to be in my top 10 of the year, the Chat Pile album from a couple of months ago, God's Country. Similar energy on that as well. Down to the fact that both albums have like a song where it's like most of the music and the heaviness kind of falls away, and it's sort of like, in this case, it's the track Out of Place, but on that record as well, I think it's the penultimate track, where it's sort of like a moment of eerie kind of stillness, essentially, and you get these sort of lyrics that feel a little bit more sort of direct and personal. And like, I don't know, it's hard to describe how this band does it in a way that a lot of the cheaper imitators that we have very much clowned on this year don't. And while I agree that this isn't, I don't think this band is kind of realizing their full potential here. I think that this is a record where what I enjoy about it is fairly uniform, and little individual moments don't so much stand out as much as what I like about the whole of it. But that said, there are moments I think represent what is so powerful about this band beautifully. Like one of the most affecting refrains of the year in Demeanor, when he's singing about, I want to feel what I've never felt before. And that to
Demeanor
me is
so
like
good.
So much of the implication there is so much more powerful than other things that bands like, Viagra Boys or Gear Band or whoever have tried to express in more, detailed or obfuscated ways. Like it's just that moment when he sings that in the chorus that is, I think, the best moment of the entire record. Like the first time that comes in, because it feels
it's
like
super potent.
Absolutely. It's just it's a very, very, very exciting album. It's a very kinetic record. It's one that I've liked more each time I've listened to it as well. It's maybe in some ways hurt by the fact that some of the broader things that it does aesthetically, beyond the specific instrumentation and just more in terms of the overarching sound impact, themes, and lyricism, are things that this year I've already had delivered to me in forms that I've already fallen so hardly in love with that it's kind of hard when you end up comparing this to them. But all the same, I think this is a really special record, and it makes me want to go back and listen to their last album as well, which a lot of people who I think were middling on this have said is even better. So I am looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to seeing whatever this band gets up to in the future as well.
Yeah, like all I have in my notes is basically just, holy Jesus fuck, what the hell? The guitar squeal is so good. Buzz and distortion, yay.
They have like pinch harmonics on here that sound like Gojira riffs. It's fucking gnarly as fuck.
I know exactly what you mean, actually. That's a very good way of describing them. Yeah. I love
that.
Even if like, you know, even if the songwriting and overarching kind of album holistic construction, all that yada 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 stuff doesn't fully connect on the highest level like I would want it to. There's so much about this record that is distinct and unique to it. Sounds, sonics, templates, aesthetics, all these sorts of things that I haven't heard anywhere else this year. And I really, really value that. And I mean, honestly, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if this continues to rise in my estimation with a little bit more time to settle with it. Because like I said, I only heard it 3 times. Both of those have been in the last couple of days. So I just need to let this one breathe a little bit more, but it gets a definite recommendation.
You gotta let the body show itself to you.
Yes.
Hey.
All right. Well, favorite tracks and ratings then for Trouble the Water. Jake, you go first.
My 3 favorite tracks gotta be, I'm gonna say Food from Plate is an eternal banger. And then I'll say I really love the 1-2 punch of Demeanor and Using It. I think that's maybe like the 3-track run there at the end of Demeanor through World War IV is where the album is at its best for me. And least favorite, I really don't have one. There's nothing here that kind of stands out as being noticeably weaker than anything else. So I don't really have a least favorite track. And I give this a really, really hearty, strong 7 out of 10. If you want something to just knock a bit to, this will do the job.
Absolutely. My 3 favorite tracks are Loose Talk, Radiator, and Demeanor. Least favorite is, I don't really know if I have one either. I guess maybe like $1.50, maybe. I honestly don't know. I even really like Out of Place, even though that one's been a little bit shed on, and some of the reviews I've seen, I actually like that as a centerpiece. So yeah. I'm going to give this album a 7 also. Jacob.
Favorite tracks on here, Food from Plate, Radiator, World War IV. Least favorite, I think the only one that like kind of just blended into the background for me, I'm gonna say was maybe Boils Up. That one I don't remember too much from. And this is gonna get, I'll give it an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed this.
Sick. Well, that gives us an average of 7.3 for Show Me the Bodies, Trouble the Water. All right, let's get into our second review of the day, which is, of course, the new album from Backxwash. His happiness shall come first, even though we are suffering. Backxwash, of course, being the Zambian Canadian rapper, artist, figure of the
friend of the Jams and Tea podcast.
Definite Jams and Tea podcast associate. She's been lovely in endorsing and responding very positively to the reviews that we've done of her in the past. And so and of course, being mutuals as well with some of us is something that is really, really cool and just something that doesn't often happen. And also just someone who is, in the online hellscape that Twitter can be, is always a really kind of refreshing and I would say vibrant presence, especially, which I think is maybe a funny word to use to describe Backxwash's Twitter presence, because her music is so just relentlessly dour and just brutal in ways that really take it out of you. Like every record that she's put out really has that just exhaustingness to it. And so it's worth noting that this record, which is the 3rd record in a trilogy, which I guess the most obvious unifying notion being that
long ass run-on sentence titles,
album titles, which are all fucking sick as hell, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%.
But yeah, the first album in this trilogy, 2020's God Has Nothing to Do with Us, leave him out of it. We reviewed that on the very second episode of the show, way back when it came out, very positively. And I remember the tone of that being like, God, there's some great songs here, but this is just like, I know she's going to level up. And that was exactly what she did with last year's I Lie Here Buried with My Rings and My Dresses, which remains one of my favorite albums of that year, definitely one of my favorite hip-hop records of that year. And here we have...
That one's a hell of a grower, honestly.
Absolutely.
I have listened to the title track on that album so many... That is literally like, that is hands down one of the best hip-hop songs of the decade, and it's barely going to be dethroned. It is so fucking hard. Ada Rook screams on that, or just fucking God.
The second verse on that track is like some of the best lyrics I've heard, period.
Beautiful
decade.
shit.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Second favorite
Great
album
record.
of the year, of that year.
Yeah, amazing
Good pick,
record.
good pick.
I very much stand by what we said about it last year, and if anything, my fondness for it has only grown. And
Ditto.
so now we're here with His Happiness Shall Come First, Even Though We're Suffering, which arrived fittingly on Halloween. And so, I mean, it's actually more recent than most of what we typically review, because it's actually been out only for about 4 or 5 days at the time we record this. So it's absolutely something we've had to consume and process in a very short amount of time. But I mean, Backwash's music, as per usual, is very immediate. It is slap you in the fucking face hard. Although I will say, I feel that one of the things that I've thought while listening to this is that though it's not particularly any longer than the last record necessarily, or more musically sophisticated or whatever in any way, I felt there's a density to this compared to the previous 2 records, subject matter wise, thematically, but also even in just the overall sound palette and aesthetic, that has definitely made it something that genuinely I've struggled to process. I don't mean that in a way where I'm kind of like couching some kind of criticism. I'm not at all. It's just been a lot to take in. And what I like about this is that for the most part, Backxwash has kind of moved away from these sort of like shorter tracks that she'll often have, sort of interstitial moments, kind of blending and pushing and connecting ideas together. And you have what is essentially a series of 4 or 5 minute songs across this record, with a couple of shorter ones, but for the most part, you're really being immersed within these individual pockets of oppressive sound. And there's a density to the experience of that is really overwhelming, but also as well, Backxwash, I think quite deliberately, is adopting more consistent one note, and I don't say that in a derogatory way, but more sort of like homogeneous flows and delivery styles here. Everything is very kind of moderate, and the delivery of everything is very sort of like, it's slowly paced in a way that makes every beat and every syllable hit with this just incomprehensible weight. It feels so oppressive at every given moment in a way that her previous albums have frequently felt, but here it's like the entire way through. I feel like it never really, speeds up or adopts a kind of, aesthetic of being like particularly pummeling in an aggressive way, but it's just very consistently brutal. And that brutality has made it feel like the most grueling experience that Backxwash has put to tape yet, I think. It's a really tough record to just process. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Cards on the table, not by a lot. It's probably going to get the same score that I gave to I Lie Here Buried, but I personally think this is Backwash's best album so far. A couple of reasons is that I think rarely do you get the benefit of seeing an artist develop with such a clear trajectory than you do with Backxwash. Just seeing her go from starting off with that first record of hers, which it wasn't her first record, which is technically Deviancy, but God Has Nothing to Do with This, is like that's an album that is like very much a hip hop album with some horrorcore aesthetics, but it's like it feels as though it's very much sticking to the fundamentals of its genre. And I think the cool thing about I Lie Here Buried is that it took on the aesthetics of metal really, really strongly and developed a kind of atmosphere that her previous music didn't quite have. And that's what gave it sort of a leg up. And not to mention, Backxwash just has such a great fucking iron grip on the idea of the construction of an album. And like, even as far back as God Has Nothing to Do with This, which is, you know, a scant 19 minutes, it's still a project that flows immaculately. That was one of the albums that I listened to the most that year, just because it was infinitely consumable in a way that complemented the material. And even though like I Lie Here Buried was a little bit longer, that sense of flow and tight pacing was still very well preserved there, and it's still a relatively short record. And this is her longest so far, which is, again, really not saying all that much considering it's still less than 40 minutes long. But even then, I still appreciate what she brings to the table in terms of setting everything up, pacing everything. And I think that moderation and care that Riley spoke to is really felt here, and that's why listening to this has felt like such a treat. Namely, the show-stopping moment here, like the show-stopping moment on I Lie Here Buried, for me, is the technical opener, Vibanda, which is utterly fucking
this bitch is cutting up Mozart on this
when
track.
She samples Lacrimosa, I like literally, like, I dropped my phone at work. I was just like, oh hell yes. And not to mention, this has one of her best constructed hooks. The I confess, I'm a mess, I'm a dog, I'm a pest, I need help, I'm possessed. God, her fucking delivery on here is like so good.
It's punk in like the most, like, aesthetically, it's like punk in the realest sense, which is that like it's one fucking flow, like it's just a bam bam bam, there's like one note that she's kind of like, you know, the one cadence that she's performing with, and it's just super minimal, but it's just beaten into you again and again and again, and that sort of ba 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 ba, all and over and over and over and over again,
moving rhythmically to this shit. And it just, and like the verses are fucking fantastic. Just like like as a lyricism, she's never not been on top of things. She's combined the sort of, you know, her, you know, experience as like in the modern day world as a Black trans woman, but also like very uniquely in the sense that it feels like unfiltered id. There's no sense of like anything else other than just the feelings and distress and pure one-to-one communication that you get, that these feelings create in her. There's the first verse on Vibanda: let it be known if there's ever death in these poems, I'm settling the onus on with perfect performance, settled the score like Lecter and Co. And it's like leather to jaw with metal and saws. That like the biggest like comparison point for her flow, her deliveries, her lyricism, the meter in her words here, it's MF Doom. She sounds like Daniel Dumoulin across this whole thing. And hell, there's one song later in the track list that just straight up, it just feels like an MF Doom song, beat and all. And that sense of like confidence really pulls through here. And there was like one or two times on I Lie Here Buried where I feel like the beats, while good, didn't quite measure up to Backxwash as a performer. And I don't really have that problem with his happiness. And while the sort of first half of the record is consistently great, mind you, beats and all, fantastic shit. It does kind of live in the shadow of Vibanda, but man, Juju through Mukazi, basically the entire like second half of this record, holy shit, it does not stop being fantastic. And the thing, well, first of all, Juju just in general is again one of the best hip-hop songs of the year.
Amazing.
The flows on here, the guest for Gais Guevara and again, all collaborations with Michael Go are absolutely appreciated because they never yield anything but phenomenal results. But that's a fantastic song with, again, great, like anytime like metal aesthetics are on this album, it feels pummeling in all the ways you would want it to, in many ways like the Show Me the Body album. But to me, one of the most impressive things about this is that it really does feel like a great capping off of this trilogy, because it feels like a synthesis of the best things about the previous two records, and that is God Has Nothing to Do with This. The writing on that album, I feel like, was really patently like naked and emotional. Like the final song on that record was something that really stuck with us. That was one of the best songs of the year on our end of the year list. Saoirse spoke very beautifully on it. And there was no shortage of emotional content on I Lie Here Buried, but again, it was very much like in one mode. Whereas here, I feel like you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the fully fleshed out aesthetic sensibilities of the previous record, and you get the sort of raw honesty of the first one. You get like a little bit of both. But one of the standout moments on here to me is kind of the closer, Mukazi. I don't know what it is about the combination of like the beat on here, the delivery. It's kind of made me tear up a little bit.
It's an
like
emotional song. I mean,
it really
they
is.
all are, but this is like it's like a tribute to the people and the things in her life that have kept her going, and it just like as a conclusion to the trilogy as well.
Talking to a younger version of yourself and telling them like, you know, that it's not going to be as bad as you thought it was going to be, even though there's still like hardship ahead. I mean, especially from somebody like Backxwash, is just innately supremely powerful. And with the kind of, again, MF Doom-esque beat that's going on here with the sort of sampled vocals, it just creates a real feeling of triumph that while, you know, Backxwash maybe didn't come out of these trials and tribulations unscathed, she came out stronger and more accomplished as an artist. And that was what really took me off guard, is that like she actually said on Twitter the other day that she thinks that this is her best album from like a production standpoint, and I agree with that. I think that there are lots of moments, like Vibanda especially is a song where like the atmospherics of it kind of feel, you know, you might take them for granted because it's so hard hitting, but just the sort of distant echoing tones that are on parts of that song, and again the lacrimosa vocals just make it feel like it's taking place in the center of a giant Gothic chapel. And Gothic is a great word to describe the overriding aesthetic of this. There's a sense of like pomp and circumstance that this album has that's like really dramatic, and it feels like it has this weight to it in a way that makes me think of the trajectory of an artist like Dalek, who I've been listening to this year, who she has said multiple times is an influence on her. I feel like the last album is very much her absence, and this album feels very much like her From Filthy Tongues of Gods and Griots, where it's sort of blending everything that they were doing before into a more well synthesized package, and it flows so well. It's so hard hitting. This is just like it's nipping at the heels of Billy Woods for my hip hop album of the year. It's so goddamn close, and who knows, by the end of the very end of the year it might actually be there. But I truly think this is an astonishing release. It's fucking amazing.
Absolutely. Obviously all her music has an intensity to it, right? But the intensity of this record and the kind of continually pummeling nature of it is something that I think leans into a huge strength of Backxwash, and something that makes her very distinct and potent as a performer. One of the critiques I've seen of her performance style is that she has, you know, I've seen people say that she has somewhat limited range in terms of how she can deliver vocals, but I think that it's less about having limited range and more about having this particular style of this, again, very, very punk ethos inspired, I would say, and very deliberate, impactful cadence, where every single word has to feel like a fucking bullet to the head. Essentially, in order to make that work, there has to be this methodical, slow pace to the way that she delivers these vocals. And it really creates this grinding and it embellishes the industrial aspects to what she does as well. And it's so well suited as well to her particular production style, to the way that she creates these really dense arrangements of sound, and of course incorporates samples in really creative and just instantly iconic ways. Like all three of her records in this trilogy like have iconic samples on them, and it's like this little motif that she comes back to, and each time she uses a sample, it feels like it relates to or distinctly identifies an aspect of the thematics of the record that makes it make sense. All right, so having the particular sample here be Mozart's Requiem on Vibanda, I think is telling in terms of where this trilogy is at this particular point, how intense and how kind of brutal the discussions of suicidality are on this record as well. The discussions of violence are on this record, the discussions of violent urges as well, and the kind of instinctive kind of like built-in sense of violence that you have to reckon with as well. The relationship between violence and performances of masculinity versus femininity, violence and, you know, existing as a queer person, existing as a minority in any different sense as well. The relationship you have with violence as you grow up into that, but also the relationship that you have with violence personally as a response to that. There's a lot about there's a lot of that in the lyricism on this record. And I mean, I could be here, I would need more time and I would need more focus to really kind of unpack that on a song by song basis. But ultimately what I would be doing is just repeating Backxwash's words for her. It's a very exciting and potent building upon of the sorts of themes and ideas and aesthetics that Backxwash has laid out for herself. And I absolutely agree as well that it shows her talent as a producer as well continuing to expand. It doesn't have the resonance and immediacy with me at the moment that the last record has, but again, that may well be a product of time, as it may well be with the Show Me the Body album. I will say as well, you know, some of the most reliable things that are always going to, you know, endear this record to me, given how much I love the previous one, the recurrence of features as well. Like one of my favorite, maybe definitely a top 3 favorite thing of that last album was the censored dialogue feature on
dialogue.
And they're back here again on this record as well. Just absolutely brutal performance. Absolutely love it. Again, the Gais Guevara feature. I mean, that's another artist that's really come to the fore this year and released the kind of what feels like a very definitive statement for them. So yeah, it's more of what you would want for a Backxwash, except it's heavier, it's grimier, it's more punishing. And I don't think I could ask for anything more than that, really.
Again, this record also just has lyrically some of the most hard-hitting shit I've heard all year. I keep thinking of the second verse in Vibanda. Put the bow in the casket, decompose into blackness, figured out. First off, I just love that pun, decompose into blackness, figured out, as this like, as this absolute, you know, as Lacrimosa is playing and she is, you know, singing about trying to get to heaven and yet being rejected, as a fucking requiem is playing. Like, I was just like, holy shit. I kept
decompose. Oh,
decomposing.
That's almost eye rolling, but I appreciate it.
I think it's perfect. I love, you know me.
I was gonna say, Jacob's the pun
puns.
lord. You can't help but appreciate that shit.
I'm not the pun lord. I'm pun trash.
Those are not mutually exclusive.
Hell.
But anyways, no, and I want to shout out, speaking of features, I want to shout out my favorite feature on the record, which comes from Pupil Slicer, which is a band I never even heard of until this record, with one of the best fucking band names of all time.
Right?
The hook sounds like it's literally melting. Her voice, so Kate, I believe, is the singer. She sounds like she is melting like right in front of you, and like with the combination of the guitars, I was just, I felt like, again, like I was being like severely beaten down, and I loved it. Like, and then you have Sadistic, who's rapping about killing the Pope and like turning it into like a religious killing to like show his dominance over God. And one of the highlights on the record is track 8, Infueti. which is a 9/8 time signature. And I remember her saying this was one of the most fun for her to write. I think she said that on Genius, because like she was trying to stay within, this very complex and time signature that doesn't make sense. And I think she does it. Like, it's this very creative, experimental flow. And that was easily one of the highlights of the record for me. But also, I want to talk about Komodo, which is the darkest song on the record to me, because it's one of the first that, like, not the first to like look at internal struggle, but the first to like one of the, at least on the record, to look at her own evil deeds, about how she felt that she had betrayed this friend. And I was, again, very much floored by that. I was walking while listening to this record and listening to these lyrics, had me literally stopping in my tracks.
It's such a vivid depiction of drug addiction as well, and like the way in which obviously the psychological impacts of reliance and withdrawal and all that sort of stuff, but also just the physicality of the way that she describes that addiction, and the places that it takes her, essentially the ways in which she feels and the actual bodily experiences that she's going through. It's visceral.
Yeah, her description of skinniness too, that was what really stood out to me on that song. But having that be arguably the darkest song on the record, and then follow it up with Mukazi, which is this, it's a song of like pure acceptance and love. That's what makes it hit so much harder for me. And I was looking up what Mukazi means, and in Luganda it means woman. And so like this is a full acceptance, finally like moving on from a dark and traumatic childhood and finally feeling happy and free. And that's what I love about that final song. This was such a treat. And Mukazi may be one of my very, very favorite songs of the year. I love that beat. And you were right. Like, I was reminded of Doom and Madlib from the way she flipped that soul sample. And because and with that flow, I think that I would say that she feels that as an MC, she's started to join the ranks of these legends. And I would honestly agree. 3 albums in and we have not had a single miss. I am always constantly excited for her. And to the person who's watching who has not gotten into Backxwash yet, start immediately. 10 years from now, she is going to be recognized as one of the greats. You crawl on your knees to her fiery altar. It's worth it.
Do it.
Like, admittedly, this is obviously going to be stuff I'm going to be into just because I'm a fucking queer horror obsessed metal nerd who also likes hip hop. It's not just that those aesthetics are found in Backxwash's music, but her music is about those things. It's not just a signifier or a choice that is implemented in style. It's about substance, and it's about applying these things. There's lots of media that's coming up. I feel like, Riley, you've talked about this at some point this year during the podcast, with movies that are coming out, like Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future and stuff. There's just there's so much music and media and movies that are taking a really interesting introspective look at our relationship to horror and sexuality and how those things sort of intersect in a way that feels a little bit more incisive and contemporary. And I feel like Backxwash's music is right up there with the best of them, portraying a very raw experience that feels so indicative of the moment. And just seeing her career kind of take off and rise, and her her follower count on Twitter has fucking exploded since fucking 2020, and just seeing that has been so fucking satisfying. So I'm very pleased to see that this development has happened, that she's been able to continue this amazing streak, as she's an artist who feels like she has limitless potential to just like, she'll either keep making records that are of this quality and of this standard, or she could experiment and end up becoming an even more adventurous and cool artist. And either way, fucking awesome, killer, can't fucking wait.
Alrighty, well, favorite tracks and rating then for this latest Backxwash album. Jacob, why don't you go first this time?
My 3 favorite tracks on here, I'm gonna say Vibanda, I am going to say Komodo, and I am going to say Mukazi. My least favorite track, even though I really like every song on here, I'd say least favorite would probably be Mulungu due to its, I guess maybe its length. Shout out to the Saint Maud reference though. That was I am going to give this is a 9. I would give this a 9. Great.
Alrighty. My 3 favorite tracks are Vibanda, Zigolo, and Juju. My least favorite track, if I had to pick one, I suppose Mulungu, yes, is the obvious pick. But yes, it's a stellar record. Don't be fooled by my rating. I think this is very great and will probably continue to grow on me. I'm going to give it an emphatic 7.5. Jake.
All right. Well, just in case I didn't make it abundantly clear before, Vibanda, hip hop song of the year. That's my favorite song on here. Closely followed by the cathartic release of Mukazi, and I'll say for the third track, the inventive awesomeness of Juju. Least favorite, I'll follow in the stead of my podcast mates and say Mulungu, but really that's just a moment that serves a more structural purpose than to be a moment in and of itself. We've been talking about the fucking White Album earlier. We got to acknowledge that shit. And I've been sitting on an 8.5 all week, and nope, I feel it. It's a 9. And I'm going to say that this is my hip hop album of the year. Unless somebody wants to drop that in the next 2 months, I doubt it will be disputed. Balls in your corner, Brockhampton. Oh.
All right.
Ooh.
Okay, well, that gives us an average of 8.5 for Backxwashers. His happiness shall come first, even though we are suffering. Let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've discussed today, the new Backxwash record or the new Show Me the Body record. Let us know, of course, what you would like for us to review in the coming weeks as well. Let us know what you think of any of the music we've discussed today. Make sure that if you enjoyed this discussion, please give the video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Both of those things help us a lot to be able to continue doing this. Remember as well that if you want to support us directly and become a member of the Jams and Tea family, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you get your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Ajax, stronger than dirt.